NATO is at the crossroads. Friday and Saturday sees the most important meeting of the organisation since the end of the Cold War. The meeting, to be held in the Portuguese capital Lisbon, will be attended by the President of Russia for the first time. So, does NATO face just a facelift or transformation? Welcome to Agenda. And joining me to discuss this is Stratfor's senior Eurasia analyst, Lauren Goodrich. Lauren, the agenda looks very different at this NATO summit, doesn't it? It's not going to be about Afghanistan, is it?
Not at all. This is actually the most critical NATO summit we've had in over a decade because they're going to be drafting the strategic concept document. This strategic concept document is actually pretty much the mission statement for NATO. It's the third one drafted since the fall of the Soviet Union. The strategic concept during the Cold War, of course, was to contain the Soviets. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the strategic concept changed to pretty much deal with the fall of the Soviet Union first, and then shifted again in 1999 in order to expand NATO's ability to intervene outside the Eurasian theater. This allowed NATO to militarily intervene in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, etc. So now it's time for the third strategic concept document to actually be drafted. This one is going to set what is NATO's focus for the next decade. What is the threats for the next decade?
So what is the threat in the next decade?
Well, that's the problem. You have 28 members now of NATO, all with different interests and different definitions of what a threat is. This is where we go into pretty much how NATO is divided into three camps. The very first camp I would call the Atlanticists. United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Denmark. The Atlanticists are interested in the non-Eurasian theater. They want NATO to focus on the threats that we've seen recently, such as the war in Afghanistan, and non-traditional threats, such as terrorism. But the second group is actually the core Europeans, led by the French and the Germans. They're more interested in limiting NATO, having NATO be leaner, having the NATO members not be as committed, and limiting their ability to commit, and also having NATO work with other organizations, such as the United Nations. Then there's the third group within NATO, which is the intermarium states. This is one of the more interesting groups because it's the newer NATO members, mainly the ones from Central Europe. What they see as a threat is what the core and the root level NATO threat was, going back to the beginning of NATO, the Soviets. So the Central Europeans want NATO to focus back on the Russians.
It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But after this, is it going to emerge as something completely different?
Well, that all depends on the strategic concept document that's drafted this weekend. But how do you draft a common document when you have so many diverging interests within NATO at this moment? The strategic concept document looks like it's only going to show how divided the alliance is now.
Let me throw that question back to you. Could this all really be resolved in just 2 days?
Well, the negotiations over this concept document have been going on for quite a while. But again, we are not seeing any ability for them to come together. Even in the past week, we've seen statements out of the French and the Poles and the United States, United Kingdom, the Germans. Everyone's on a different page.
Lauren, why did the Russians accept an invitation to attend, and what do they expect to get out of it?
Well, the NATO Summit is actually in two parts. The very first part is the NATO Summit, in which they're going to be discussing the strategic concept document. The second part of the summit is actually the Russia-NATO Summit, which is the reason why Russian President Dmitry Medvedev was invited. Medvedev is going with two goals. The very first goal is to see what comes out of the first part of the summit. The more divided NATO is, especially over this strategic concept document, the better it is for the Russians. The Russians know that as long as NATO is divided, then it can never agree on things such as NATO expansion, especially into the former Soviet states, or declaring Russia as the target of their focus. So that's the first focus for Medvedev this weekend. The second is for Medvedev to sit down with U.S. President Barack Obama. This is the very first one-on-one chat between the two since the U.S. elections. Russia was very wary going into these elections because they know that the Republicans tend to have a firmer and more aggressive take on Russia. And since the elections, which did not quite go in Obama's favor, occurred, Russia has grown very wary on whether Obama was going to stick to his previous commitments of having warmer relations with Russia.
I suppose one of the ironies of all this is just as things look as if they could change, they might not change because of the state of America's politics.
Very much so. The United States and Russia seemed as they were on a warming period under Barack Obama, starting in April, but really fleshing out over the summer. The United States and Russia decided that it was better to have a temporary détente between their two countries in order for them to focus on much more important issues of the moment. For the United States, this meant that they needed Russia to agree to sanctions on Iran and logistical support for Afghanistan. For Russia, this meant that they needed the United States to cease support for Georgia and Ukraine, freeze ballistic missile defense plans in Central Europe, as well as commit to aiding Russia in its modernization and privatization programs. Both sides actually agreed on all of this until the elections. The START treaty ended up being pretty much the bellwether of whether this temporary détente was being successful or not. The START treaty looked like it was going to slide through both legislators in Russia and the United States easily until the elections. And now we have a stall on START.
So summing up, isn't NATO really just playing into Russia's hands? As these groups in NATO argue about the future, the Russians just get on with their own business.
Very much so. They're counting on the divergence and divisions within NATO. As long as it's divided, Russia will have a much easier time in order to clamp down on its resurgence, especially in its former Soviet states, and be able to start even pushing on the NATO members themselves.
Lauren, thanks very much. Lauren Goodrich there. And that's Agenda for this week. I'm Colin Chapman. See you next time.